I think Josh has got you all set up. Hygiene connects you to your sense of dignity.
Woo, man, I feel better.
We learn their names, we learn their stories, we provide all this extra support. It's like creating community around them, and we call that radical hospitality.
To see radical hospitality in action, go to cnnheroes.com for more on that. Also this, as we race now towards James Comey's coming testimony on Capitol Hill next week, CNN is hearing from voters on whether or not they stand, where they stand on their decision to vote for President Trump in the face of this pivotal moment in the Russian election meddling probe. CNN's Bill Ware went back to his hometown to find out, among other things. Watch out. Watch this.
And all this talk about Russia, what do you make of that?
You know, no offense to news people, but it just seems a lot of hype is going on. I don't follow it as much as some people do because I don't believe in it. What will come out will come out.
Yeah.
And if it's true, it will come out.
Yes, I'm concerned about Russia, but Russia is meddling. That's just what they're doing. And they've done it all your life, all my life.
This is Don Long, the beloved local veterinarian.
As far as the election is concerned, what did they do? Were they in the voting booth with you? They weren't in the voting booth with me.
Bill Weir is here with much, much more. Bill, this is fascinating. And also fascinating is we've been, of recent, watching you travel around the globe to some of the most remote spots in the world. What sent you home? Why home?
Well, I moved around a lot as a kid. I went to 17 schools in 6 states. My mom was a born-again Christian who believed that God was speaking to her in dreams. And so I was watching the election from Bhutan or Iceland and watching my Facebook feed, one half giddy over the idea of Donald Trump, the other half in deep depression. I thought, why don't I retrace my steps, talk to friends and family, try to see the world through their eyes? Because ultimately, we the people have to figure out if we want to keep this experiment going. It's kind of a miracle we've lasted 240 years, so many different ideas and value systems that come together.
So were you surprised with what you heard?
What I was surprised about is how distant people are in the most connected age in human history.
Oh, that's a really good way of putting it.
And in Wautoma, Wisconsin, where I used to spend my summers, I spent 1 year of high school there, I spent a week there, and you meld in, you tune out, you forget the daily sort of soap opera that we're so obsessed by tweet, minute by minute. And a lot of friends just say, you know what, I vote once, I don't think about it again for 4 years. And it's interesting information to have for both parties as they think about, you know, where we go from here.
And I was reading some of the material, like you wrote something on CNN.com about this, and this one line stuck out to me. It's time to ask our countrymen, where are you from? With a lot less fear and a lot more wonder.
Right, right.
I love that. What do you mean?
Well, I meant that if you strip away the borders of the 50 states and just look at immigrant streams and the values they brought when they got off what ship from where, there's really 11 distinct American nations. We're more like Europe than we think, you know, and people don't ask, why don't the Greeks and the Germans get, because they're from different countries. And if you're in Greater Appalachia or Yankeedom, those are different countries. And I think if you say, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? It helps me understand why you vote the way you do, how you define the definition, you know, how you define liberty and justice for all, because we all have very different definitions of what that means.
So fascinating and beautifully shot, as always, with all of your work.
And Jackie Kucinich of the Daily Beast. Follow the money is a trademark phrase from the Watergate investigation. Now, also courtesy of Washington Post reporting, let's try a little follow the plane. Remember, former FBI Director James Comey is set to publicly testify before Congress next Thursday. Issue number one for Director Comey, of course, will be conversation in which he says the president tried to get him to pledge his loyalty and then tried to get him to shut down key aspects of the Russia meddling investigation. But it's also a pretty safe bet Comey will also be asked what he knows about a mysterious December meeting between presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner and Sergei Gorkov, a Russian spy turned banker who's tight with Vladimir Putin. That's where the plane comes in. The Post reports today that flight tracking data show a plane routinely used by Gorkov traveled from Moscow to Newark in mid-December. A day later, it flew from Newark to Tokyo, where President Putin was at the time. What was on the Kushner-Gorkov agenda?
Mr. Gorkov, quick question. What did you really speak to Jared Kushner about in New York when you met him in December?
No comments.
Did you talk about sanctions? Excuse me.
No comments.
Well, what was discussed? The White House says it was a diplomatic meeting, that Kushner met you as part of the transition team. Your bank says it was a business meeting.
Thank you so much. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Were you a conduit? Were you a conduit to the Kremlin, Mr. Gorkov?
That's CNN's Matthew Chance giving it better than the college try there. Mr. Gorkov not answering. How important are the answers, though, to this, in the sense that Mr. Gorkov's bank, they won't talk anymore, but they stand by a statement where they say the meeting with Jared Kushner was about private business, the Kushner companies, real estate, New York investment. Gorkov's bank invests Russian money in the United States. That's what they say it was about. The White House, on behalf of Kushner, says it was about normal transition business and just building relationships for once Jared Kushner became a senior advisor to the president. Now, was Jared Kushner trying to cash in on his about-to-be senior advisor role? That's one question Democrats are going to push. Or was he trying to have some conversation about sanctions is another question, because Gorkov's bank at the time was under Obama administration sanctions. What's the answer? And when do we find out?
Well, look, I don't know that we're going to find out the answer at this hearing, though everybody's going to be on the edge of their seats, obviously, but there's a lot of investigation to go, and I think Comey's going to be very careful about what he shares. I think that the real thing that underscores why it's all so important is that this is the direct connection to the current White House, right? This is not Paul Manafort, who was connected in the campaign but is no longer here. It's not even Flynn, who was in the White House and is gone. This is not only the current White House and the senior advisor to the president, but the son-in-law. And so I think that makes all of these questions all the more important, and I think, you know, not to mention all of the other questions about what Director Comey said to the president, what the president said to him. But I mean, it's a huge hearing. I think we're all going to be watching carefully.
There's also the distinction between whether improper things were done in these meetings and whether illegal things were done at these meetings. Now, if he was trying to trade on his business with his incoming position, chances are that's improper but not illegal without a clear quid pro quo for some policy. If there's something else going on here, and you know, a lot of this Russia investigation has just been more smoke every time, and we don't know what's behind it. We don't know why the president's been trying so hard to stop these Russia investigation, to take the heat off Flynn. We don't know exactly what Flynn's motives were in these meetings. Then you have you know, an attack dog, Bob Mueller, who's investigating this stuff, and I think there's broad confidence that he will get to the bottom of it.
And just before you jump in, I just want to say, Jared Kushner's attorney, Jamie Gorelick, says he's eager to tell his story. That's right. And we should take him at his word that he's eager to tell his story. However, there's a Republican-controlled Congress. I would assume a senior advisor to the Republican president, if he wanted to tell his story, could get that hearing scheduled pretty quickly.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is that you've also seen other members of the Kushner family use their connections to the White House as a way to lure in business and lure in investment. And so was this a part of that? We don't know that. That's what the Russian bank says. But it's not without precedent in this current administration for the Kushners to do that.
And he's on the cover, I should note, Jared Kushner's on the cover of Time magazine this week, and this in the past we know when Steve Bannon was on the cover as the great manipulator, that did not sit well with the president. Now Steve Bannon, we'll get to this in a bit, Paris Climate, he seems to be back up. He was down after that. But when you see this, you hear from time to time, of course he's the president's son-in-law, of course he's the ambassador of everything or secretary of everything. He has a pretty broad portfolio, but that this president, like any politician, also has sort of a line that if you become a liability to me, then things get different.
That's true, and we're all still at this table getting to know Jared Kushner and Donald Trump and the entire administration sort of week by week, month by month. But one thing that I would say about my observations on Jared Kushner so far is he's a deliberate, cautious, sort of behind-the-scenes operator, and perhaps better than anyone else in that White House, this is his father-in-law. He understands the nuances of what we're talking about, that if you put person X in the spotlight, it's likely to, you know, anger the president, and so on and so forth. I think one question we've had with Michael Flynn is, in terms of his conversations with the Russians, did he ask whatever he asked about sanctions or anything else at the president's behest or completely on his own? With Jared Kushner, it seems much more likely that anything on that front was something that he would not have done without the president's knowledge, and I think that's part of where some of these questions are going to go.
And to that point, the first meeting with Ambassador Kislyak took place at Trump Tower. We don't know exactly where the Gorkov meeting took place. We know that plane came. There's no confirmation he was on that plane, but we know it came and we know they met. Jared Kushner confirms that they met. He says it was just, you know, normal transition business, and the question is, why do you have normal transition business with a bank under sanctions from a guy who's a former spy who's close to Vladimir Putin? That's a legitimate question. You mentioned the Comey, I mentioned the Comey testimony. One of the big questions is, would the President of the United States try to block it? Comey was an executive branch employee at the time. The president has the right to private conversations with executive branch senior officials. He could try to exert at least executive privilege. Now, some people say he's already talked about it himself. The president has so much that would be thin ice to walk on. But listen here, Kellyanne Conway on television this morning. Is this the answer to the question, will the president try to stop it?
Well, we'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies. The last time he testified under oath, the FBI had a scurry to correct that testimony
so
to
the president's not
and
going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
So the president will make that decision, but she does seem to suggest that they will be watching, and she takes an opportunity to smack Director Comey there too a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of smacking of Director Comey next week. I don't think you could silence Director Comey. Now, you could exert executive privilege, but much of what he's going to testify about we already know because former colleagues of Comey and friends of his have already leaked it to the press. So this is a guy who has a long history of saying what he thinks needs to be said, and so I don't think as a play they could maybe try and do this. It may not work, but it wouldn't have the effect they want in keeping anything quiet.
There's sort of a rule to Washington: when you attack senior officials in the intelligence community, then we all go to sleep and wake up, and within one or two good nights, there's something on the front page of a newspaper. I mean, they are going to be aggressive against him. They are going to challenge his credibility. But is that a smart move?
Well, I mean, what they can't do, I think, politically, is actually try to stop his testimony. I think the city would kind of explode. You know, so I think, like Mike says, I think we're going to see them try to undermine his testimony, call into question some of the things that he's saying, his spin on things. But I think the idea of exerting executive privilege would, I mean, look, I've been surprised before with this administration, but I think it would be surprising if they tried to do that.
The other problem is that the president himself has talked about the conversations and characterized them, which could have waived his executive privilege already. That could be argued if he tries to stop. Now, he might try to slow it down. I mean, nothing surprises me anymore. But in terms of silencing Comey entirely, as you said,
I have a fascinating question going forward in the sense of we know what the Democrats want to do. They want the Comey to read his memos if he can, or at least discuss his memos if he can. The president had dinner with you and asked you to pledge his loyalty. Please explain. The president met with you and sent everyone else out of the Oval Office and asked you to shut down the Flynn investigation. Please, you have the floor, sir. That's what the Democrats want to do. My big question is, what do the Republicans do? Do they aggressively come to the president's defense, or is this one where they say, no thank you?
They talk a lot about unmasking. The pattern has been that they try in all these Russian hearings to talk about how other leaks have gone out and whether there was anything improper about the part of the Russian investigation the president most wants to talk about.
And leaks, and leaks in which are very legitimate avenues of inquiry. I want to come back to hearing President Putin, because it is interesting that the Russians first, the answer from the Russians was, we had nothing to do with it. You people are making this all up. It was absolutely nothing. Then yesterday it became, well, the government had nothing to do with it, but there might be some patriots, Russian patriots, who decided they wanted, the heroes and artists who wanted to help the state. Listen to President Putin today, where he sounds a lot like Donald Trump. He says, look, Hillary Clinton lost, and she's looking for an excuse.
They voted for him, and the other team, they made a mistake, and they don't want to recognize this mistake right now. They don't want to say that they were not wise enough. It's easy to say it's not our fault. It's the Russians. They intervened. They interfered. It's like anti-Semitism. The Jews are to blame. You're an idiot because the Jews are to blame.
Blaming the Russians to anti-Semitism, to the idea that suddenly Putin is talking more about this himself. Is that just coincidence, or as we get further from the election, but also closer to some of the huge moments in the investigation and in the public testimony like Comey, that he's deciding he wants to be in the mix?
I think there's a level of gloating going on. Yeah. I think he's bragging to the world that he got away with this. I mean, the idea that authoritarian state, a guy who's very proud of his powers there, whose opponents end up getting jailed or killed mysteriously, doesn't know what the hobbyists with internet connections are doing with the U.S. government, I think he said at another point that Russia doesn't have much of a cyber capability. I mean, it's like they're absurd claims, but he's making jokes, and everybody's enjoying the fact that he's now on the Russian stage on the world stage at a far higher level than they were before.
Absolutely, no question. Everybody sit tight, and it's next Thursday, remember. You can hear what the fired FBI director has to say, Jim Comey, right here on CNN. CNN's coverage of James Comey's testimony will begin next Thursday, 9 a.m. You see it right there. When we come back, the unemployment rate dips again, but job growth stalls, and whatever the president says, well, the number. Healthcare continues to be a huge driver in the economy right now. Keep an eye on this one as the healthcare debate makes its way through Congress. Yesterday, even before this report came out, the president was in the Rose Garden. His top priority was to talk about climate change, but he also put in a plug for his record on jobs.
economy is starting to come back, and very, very rapidly. We've added $3.3 trillion in stock market value to our economy and more than 1 million private sector jobs.
That's among several things the president said at that event that would not quite pass the fact check. He was talking yesterday. He said more than 1 million private sector jobs. Even if you include today's new numbers in private sector jobs, during the Trump presidency, they're up to 601,000. So he is more than $400,000 off in that math. The president clearly wants to, any president wants to say, hey, I'm in office, the economy's going to get better. But it's actually been a mixed picture so far. If you've got your 401k, you're looking at Wall Street, pretty good. If you're looking at that jobs growth, it's up. You're going. It's above. It's not negative, but it's not great.
This is a Bloomberg stat, right? But this is the weakest 3-month payroll gain since 2012. It's not to say the jobs aren't growing. It's just to say that this is not the pace of the past in terms of that. When you offset it against unemployment, a lot of other factors, it is a mixed bag, exactly as you said. The problem for President Trump is that he's hinted so many of his policies, the explanation for withdrawing from Paris, the explanation for why he wants to do all these tax cuts, on the notion of 3-4%, maybe more, 5% GDP growth. And on the one hand, you can look at these numbers and say that's why we need all these policies to get to 3 or 4%. On the other hand, it makes getting to 4% that much harder.
Well, and I guess I would also say that maybe more than most presidents, this one made dramatic promises during the campaign about what would happen to people's jobs. Manufacturing jobs were going to come racing back. Coal, everybody was going to be employed that wanted to be employed. Again, as Margaret says, you got to wait a little bit until some of his policies are given a chance, but it sure doesn't look like if you're one of those steel workers or one of those coal miners, you're not feeling the effects of the Trump presidency yet.
And it could catch up with him because of those promises, because if those jobs aren't coming back, I mean, we all know other presidents who've talked about major job growth, and if they're not feeling it on the ground, which is one of the things that really fueled President Trump's rise, is that Obama kept talking about increasing jobs, and in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, they weren't seeing it where they lived. So if they're not, all of his promises are going to catch up with him.
That's a great point, especially, and we're going to get to the map in a little bit, because the president used it to make his climate change agreement. But if you look at the states Trump won, he tapped into that. The president keeps telling you things are getting better. Hillary Clinton says another term of Obama. You live this. You know it. You don't feel it. The question, when you listen to, here's the vice president of the United States, if they keep saying this and those numbers don't improve, do they run the same risk?
There's a reason why the month of May we just found out 250,000 new jobs have been created. This economy
Over 1 million now.
It's remarkable, Sean. As I travel around the country, the confidence, the enthusiasm, I tell people from the shop room floor to the boardrooms in this country know that they've got someone in the Oval Office who gets up every day and is fighting for them.
When I first came to Washington, I covered the labor beat, and the vice president there made a fundamental rookie mistake, and he should know better. Number one, he knows he's on a cheerleading show with Sean Hannity, but he was quoting from an ADP, a private sector guesstimate that comes out every month that thought the numbers were going to show 250,000. Then the government comes out the next day and tells you 138,000. So the vice president was wrong, number one. Plus, that you get back to that point. If you keep telling people, we're here now and everything's great, if they don't feel it, you got a problem.
That said, the animal spirits matter, and Donald Trump is nothing if not a salesman, and he has convinced a lot of people. It's hard to know exactly how much of this is him and how much of it is other things that are happening in the economy. He has convinced a lot of people to invest more, to double down on the economy right now, and I think they're going to do everything they can to keep, that's the thing they can control. They can't get tax reform through right now. They can't get Obamacare through right now. The regulatory stuff is still tinkering on the edges. They can't really hit the economy in the mainstream, but they can keep talking about it.
You make a critical point, because the psychology of Trump is what helped the markets early on.
That's right.
Businesses thought he's going to lift regulations, and he is doing that, and they can do a lot of that administratively. So we have this conversation now in June, July, August, September, October, November. We will likely see a lot more of the Trump administration using its executive power to roll back regulations. But repeal and replace Obamacare, Congress. Listen to the president yesterday saying tax reform, great.
Our tax bill is moving along in Congress, and I believe it's doing very well. I think a lot of people will be very pleasantly surprised. The Republicans are working very, very hard. We'd love to have support from the Democrats, but we may have to go it alone, but it's going very well.
Again, it's our job sometimes to check facts, even if it's the President of the United States. He doesn't have a tax bill. He has a piece of paper.
Yeah.
He has a piece of paper with some bullet points on it that says, I'd like to do this. And that's fine. That's a defensible way to do it. If Congress is writing the legislation, you can send them up guidelines and say, here, make sure it fits this, and you guys fill in the blanks. There's nothing wrong with that. But when he stands in the Rose Garden and says, our bill is doing great and it's fine, and we know that his own Treasury Secretary is up on Capitol Hill trying to convince House Republicans to abandon their Speaker and the centerpiece of the Paul Ryan tax reform proposal, their bill's in trouble.
And psychology is political psychology is a lagging indicator, right? So there will be a lot of sort of people still hoping, businesses still hoping that tax reform is moving ahead the way the President says it is, and that health care might somehow get a revival or whatever. But eventually it's going to catch up. And eventually there's going to be a realization 2, 3, 4, or 5 months that the 2018 cycle is upon us, that some of this stuff is not going to happen, and then the question is, does Wall Street, do these businesses bake that all of a sudden into, and the confidence fades.
And there are a lot of Republicans who would either like to see that White House plan or get permission to begin moving their own.
And like health care, all Republicans don't agree on tax reform. They can't count on all of them to get it through.
You mean, who knew?
Who knew?
It's complicated. Economic issues. He looks at this map. Particularly, the President looks at this. The former blue states he turned red in last year's elections. And the climate change decision he made yesterday actually is risky for the President politically, because if you look at the data, it's not what the American people want. 90% of Democrats, as you see, think climate change is real. A majority of Republicans think climate change is real, 54% there. And what about the specifics? Should we stay or should we go when it comes to the Paris climate change deal? Well, millennials, Generation X, so younger voters, their support for the Paris deal is higher, but look, it runs across the spectrum. Baby boomers, World War II veterans, nearly 7 in 10 or higher than 7 in 10 say we should stay in the deal. So why would the President get out? And let's look at it from a more political perspective. Slide this over here. 86% of Democrats say stay in the Paris Accords, but even a narrow majority, 51% of Republicans say stay in, and almost half of the President's voters, 47% of Trump voters say stay in the Paris Climate Change Accord. So the President was not doing this because his base was overwhelmingly demanding he get out based on climate change. The President looks at this map, remembers the last election, and thinks on every big decision he's going to make the point that for these people here, whether you're in coal mining or manufacturing, it's not about climate change, it's about jobs.
The Paris Agreement handicaps the United States economy in order to win praise from the very foreign capitals and global activists that have long sought to gain wealth at our country's expense. They don't put America first. I do. And I always will.
The condemnation is broad. The President has put himself and Republicans on a pretty small island, both domestically and globally. But in his mindset, this is how he thinks. This is what he talks about NAFTA, when he talks about TPP, that the elites have conspired against the blue-collar American, and I'm going to change it.
And look, I think there's a way in which those numbers are a little bit misleading, because I don't think they're thinking about raw numbers and specific districts and what have you. They're thinking about his brand, right? And he built a brand that really was around this idea of the kind of the forgotten America, America first, that whole thing. And I think their thinking was, and Steve Bannon, who we saw yesterday along the sidelines of the thing, was if he didn't do this, if he stayed in Paris, that it totally undercut the message and the narrative that he's been building about what is his presidency about. And to that extent, I think it makes sense politically.
Right, he would have been a globalist to stay in, and that he wants to be a populist or a nationalist.
And I think there are several areas in which he already has compromised those kind of base campaign views. He was going to declare China a currency manipulator. He took a break when he realized the implications for North Korea and sort of geopolitics, NAFTA, NATO-ish, pretty much. And so this was one place to make a stand, but it's predicated on two very strong beliefs, convictions. One, is that the Republicans will continue to control both chambers of commerce after the midterm elections.
Right.
And number two is that the Democrats are so feckless or ineffectual or disorganized or whatever that they will not be able to mount a serious contender in 2020. If either one of those things isn't true, the calculus of all of this comes into question.
He also built into the speech yesterday, he said, maybe we can renegotiate it, that'd be good. If I can't renegotiate it, that'd be okay too. The whole premise of his presidency has been, I can get you a better deal. And so wherever the policy, he could back off this policy. Now we're withdrawing from Paris. Maybe in 6 months, a year, he says, oh, we've renegotiated. I'm not going to pay the, $3 billion to developing countries. We got a better deal. We're back in.
The interesting part is most people say since it's a non-binding agreement,
Right.
that he could have done that anyway. He could have said, Obama committed to X, I'm only going to do 60% of X, or I'm going to change Obama's commitment this way. But instead, for the brand, he decided, no, I'm going to walk away. I'm going to blow it up. I'm Trump the disruptor. I'm going to blow it up. A fair question, though, even though he views this more about the brand and about economics and about I'm on your side than about climate change. It is a fair question when the President of the United States pulls out of a global climate change agreement to ask the question, does the President believe that human activity influences global warming and climate change, or does he still believe, as he said repeatedly earlier in his life, that it's a hoax? Ask the staff. Get this.
The president believes in a clean environment, clean air, clean water. He's received awards as a businessman in that regard. And he made very clear yesterday what he doesn't believe, which is that the U.S. government should stay in an agreement.
What President Trump believes is he was elected to grow the U.S. economy and provide great job opportunities for American citizens.
This is about making sure that America, as we negotiate CO2 reductions, that we do so with an America First approach.
Is it not a fair question of a democratically elected president on an issue that, again, that is big across the whole world, not just here in the United States of America? Do you or don't you? But now they all say you have to ask him. Is that because they don't know the answer, or because they've learned from other issues not related to this one that they might say something today and he might undermine them tomorrow?
Well, and he might say something one day and undermine himself the next day. I mean,
Yes.
it's not clear, he's not answering the question because there's no political upside to answering the question. There are a huge part of his base who don't believe, who've come down on this, that the science and the elites have all lied to them, and none of this is true. He doesn't want to alienate them.
And let me just say, on behalf of the press corps, the Washington and the White House press corps, we would love to ask him directly, but having come back from a 9-day foreign trip where they gave no opportunities for the press corps to ask President Trump a question which is totally against tradition on these trips, and we have very little opportunity ever to ask him questions. So we would love to.
News conference would be great.
You mentioned the president's view, and I know this is Steve Bannon's view, that perhaps he'll even be a third-party candidate next time, so the president can win again with his base, or that he can win those states, even if his numbers go down in California and down in New York, down on the coasts, where the more liberal voters and more climate change might be more of an issue, that they can win again. The question is, how do the Democrats react? We've seen a bunch of Democratic governors saying we're going to have our own climate agreement. We saw protests, and you see some lights in several big cities, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., among the cities that had this sort of show of support that we're going to continue to do this. We're going to stay in the climate change. Listen to Tom Perez, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee right here, trying to make the Democrats' argument. The question is, can they make an argument on television, or can they win at the polls?
We're here to tell this president, you can't ban hurricanes from entering this country. You cannot dismiss rising tides and temperatures as fake news. You know what? We shouldn't have to wait until Mar-a-Lago goes underwater before this president starts understanding climate change.
It's a clever line, but even though you look at those poll numbers, the support is pretty overwhelming for the belief in climate change. The support is pretty overwhelming among Democrats and independents for doing something about it, and Republicans are more evenly split. But there's not a lot of evidence, despite those numbers, that it is, come election day, that this is one of those issues that moves to the top. People vote on the economy. People vote on leadership. In the last election, they voted on changing Washington and brand Trump. So no matter what the numbers say, there's not a lot of evidence that this is one of those things where people say, damn it, this is what I'm voting on.
They would be smart to make this about jobs like the president has. They would be smart to make this about the economy and incorporate the climate change message into something that can reverberate and really apply to people in their everyday lives, rather than Mar-a-Lago going underwater. This is where the national Democrat leadership really needs to plug into their local base, because they haven't really done a good job with that, particularly with midterm elections in the last couple of cycles.
Isn't it telling that it's Tom Perez, like a relatively anonymous bureaucrat, who's carrying the Democratic message right now?
Right.
I mean, the next election is going to be decided by two candidates, a choice between two people. And Democrats don't really have anybody who is showing at this point, they don't have to have someone at this point, but they don't have anybody showing at this point that they can stand up toe-to-toe with Trump.
And to the economic point, if they have a lot of candidates running out there for these governor's races and these House races and these Senate races, they need to, if they come up with a coherent answer on the economics, which is something Hillary...
But I do think it is an actual mistake, both for the US and for our planet. Because wherever we live, whoever we are, we all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
The position of the United States to step out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement is very regrettable, and I'm expressing myself very carefully when I say that.
Now, it's often said that one Trump trademark is that he loves to be loved, loves to be showered with praise. In this case, the president is wearing that scorn as a badge of honor.
The same nations asking us to stay in the agreement are the countries that have collectively cost America trillions of dollars through tough trade practices and, in many cases, lax contributions to our critical military alliance. You see what's happening?
Who's right? Team Trump says this is one deal. He can continue to do whatever they do on climate here in the United States outside of Paris. He says he'll be the cleanest president ever when it comes to the environment, and that this will not be such a big deal. You move on to the next issue and you do this transactionally. You listen to some of these other world leaders and they think this is serious. Forget the issue at hand. Seriously undermines American leadership in the world. It'll be hard for the United States to step forward and lead. And other examples, your newspaper, big headline says it's a gift to China, which has been looking to step forward and assert itself as a global leader. Which is it?
Well, look, I mean, we'll see how it plays out. The kind of diplomatic dance that countries go through often depends on the issue at hand. So it may be that down the road when the United States and some of these other countries are dealing with other unrelated issues, it may be that there's still a lot of interest in those countries to get the United States help and to cooperate with the United States. So it's not like all is lost. But the truth is, when the United States goes to another country and, sort of hat in hand and says, help us with troop levels in Afghanistan, or help us with the South China Sea, or help us with North Korea, this lingers. The issue of this climate accord and the kind of abandonment that the United States has sort of decided to undertake, that will linger. And
it came after the public lecture of NATO allies in Brussels, so there was sort of you begin to see almost a domino effect in those European leaders. Now, and part of it, let's be honest, the president was playing to what he believes is his domestic political base. They're playing to their audience as well. That Trump is in. We could put the Der Spiegel cover up, German magazine of the cover. Trump is the boogeyman in Europe right now, without a doubt. And so some of these politicians are, God forbid, being politicians.
But he's risking two kinds of being marginalized, and he's decided that it's a risk we're taking. The one risk is that the U.S. would be politically marginalized. The kind of parallel risk is that President Trump inside the U.S. would be marginalized by this move. You're seeing now this collection of businesses, including Exxon, many other businesses, kind of saying they're going to band together and go forth with their own environmental plans to try to continue to meet what would have been the U.S. Commitments under the Paris Accords. And that's very interesting if that holds. That in combination with what you may see some of these governors, right now it's Democratic governors, it's like Jerry Brown, right? But if you see a broader collection of governors pursue this, if all these kind of both market and political forces inside the U.S. decide they want to save the Paris Accord, the U.S. role in the Paris Accord, with or without the White House, that's a different kind of process that'll play out.
Yeah, and there might be a little bit of cutting off your nose to spite your face here. Last night when Gary Cohn was talking to Wolf, he said something about, Wolf asked him about the country being left behind. And what he used to defend that was saying Silicon Valley is somewhere where there's been a lot of innovation and has been led by the United States. Well, you already have France saying, come here, we're a better climate for you, we're more in line with your values. That sort of thing could end up hurting the country if some of these Silicon Valley companies decide to say, no, you know what? You're right.
The other thing, we've mentioned it here a little bit, but it's important to remember the Paris Agreement does not determine how much carbon the U.S. will be emitting in the next 10 years. So when Trump says we're going to create all these jobs and we're going to change the economy and all that, that hasn't happened yet. Moving out of the Paris Agreement just means we are not going to abide by previous voluntary standards. Now the discussion in this country will begin about, okay, what do we want to do with fuel economy standards? What do we want to do with the Clean Power Act? What do we want to do with utilities? What do we want to do with methane gas and wildcat oil producers? And those decisions, including ones made by states and companies, will determine how much carbon we're putting out.
But the she implications and the implications, we already know about the sort of Trump, Angela Merkel power game, but Macron really is trying to get in there himself, maybe just for domestic consumption, but it seems like on a broader stage than that, from the handshake to the Make the Planet Great Again line, I think it's hard to miss. He is stepping up to start a challenge with President Trump, but I do think the Chinese leader and how that plays out in terms of trade, in terms of North Korea talks, is going to be very interesting now.
And the statements in the Chinese media, which of course are closely aligned with the government, have been very damning. In court, Steve Bannon won. Ivanka Trump lost. Both waged aggressive efforts to win the president's head and his heart in the fierce months-long debate over the Paris Climate Accords. And in the end, the president's daughter not only came out on the losing side, but a number of administration officials say she most likely overplayed her hand, had her efforts backfired. She was not on hand for the big announcement, nor was her husband, Jared Kushner. While they were at synagogue for a Jewish holiday, Steve Bannon basked in what for him was a Rose Garden resurgence. And how much do we make of this, or is it a mistake to make too much of this? That, again, as I noted earlier in the show, it was a couple months back, everyone said Steve Bannon is on thin ice at the White House. He's out, he's getting too much press attention. The president doesn't, the president thinks he's, pushes him out of favor. This is Ivanka Trump, who was the great moderate hope, if you will. Democrats, others saying she's the one who will get to the president and these big ones and keep him from going onto the Steve Bannon reservation. Well, on this one she failed.
Well, but to be fair, she did have a tougher job than the Steve Bannons of the world, because this is where the president was during the campaign. This is what his promise was, and she had to bring him back from the edge. Now, if anyone could do it, could it be her? Sure. But she definitely had a tougher job than the Steve Bannons of the world to completely change his mind on this.
I would put this in the category of something to watch. I mean, I do think that Steve Bannon helped Donald Trump win the election, not Ivanka Trump. And Ivanka Trump's role in this White House in those early weeks and months always was uncertain in terms of how sort of officially part of the process is she going to be and how much is just she going to be sort of around. But ultimately for him to have stayed in that agreement would have represented a real threat to the base. I think we need to see if this is a one-off or if this is a trend.
Right. When it comes to just the focus on her, it's an adult, an adult daughter of a president in the White House, deciding to take on senior advisor, deciding to have an office with her husband, who's right there. I just want to go back to April. She was on CBS this morning with Gayle King, talking about her role and whether people should or should not expect much.
I think that for me, this isn't about promoting my viewpoints. I wasn't elected by the American people to be president. I think my father is going to do a tremendous job, and I want to help him do that. But I don't think that it will make me a more effective advocate to constantly articulate every issue publicly where I disagree. And that's okay. That means that I'll take hits from some critics who say that I should take to the street.
Does she take a hit for this?
People have talked about this divide in the White House as an ideological one. There are moderates, there's Wall Street people, there's New York people, and then there's ideologues, conservatives. There is that divide, and sometimes each side wins. I think the more operative divide, though, has to do with the people who are there for Donald Trump, who know him for a long time, for more than a year. Most people in the White House have known him for 6 months or 8 months, and who in the end will always be fighting for him. Now, there's no doubt that Ivanka and Jared are still in that camp. Keith Schiller, there's other people in that orbit that are in that camp, and that gives them their power. It's not that they're moderates or not, and so I think losing this, reading too much into it, kind of gets away from that essential fact. That
Don Spicer and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, they will be taking questions from reporters later this hour. We'll have live coverage of that coming up. But let's begin with the Russia investigation and new and important developments. Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's over at the White House. Our senior international correspondent, Matthew Chance, is in St. Petersburg, Russia. And our congressional correspondent, Phil Mattingly, is joining us from Washington. Jim, as you know, Yahoo News is reporting that there was a secret but unsuccessful effort in the early days of the Trump administration to get those sanctions against Russia lifted. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, Wolf, we know that during the early days of the administration and really the early months of this administration, this was a key discussion going on behind the scenes inside the White House. But top officials have been sort of all over the place on this issue. Keep in mind, just last week during the president's foreign trip, Gary Cohn, the president's top economic advisor, was asked what is the president's position on sanctions, and he said the president didn't really have one. Then he had to clarify himself the next day and say, no, we do believe on keeping these sanctions in place until Russia changes its behavior in Ukraine. That is essentially the position that's been taken by the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. But we do know, Wolf, by trying to confirm a Washington Post report earlier this week, the Yahoo News report mentions this as well, is that there is a discussion going on between the Russians and the Trump administration about those Russian compounds that the Russians were were expelled from during the last days of the Obama administration. That was in retaliation that the Obama administration took for Russia's actions in the U.S. election. And so the question becomes, well, is this something that the U.S. is preparing to do? I talked to a senior administration official earlier this week who said, no, this still hinges on whether the Russians change their behavior in Ukraine, but it is something that is up for discussion. It's something that they're talking about among many issues. It's been described as being on a parallel track with these discussions going on between the U.S. and Russia on Syria. Some of those discussions are scheduled to take place this month in St. Petersburg, featuring some top State Department officials, Wolf.
Yeah, those two Russian compounds on the eastern shore of Maryland, outside of Washington, and out on Long Island, outside of New York City, both shut down by the Obama administration, still shut down now. Matthew, you're in St. Petersburg, Russia. Listen to what President Vladimir Putin said when asked about the sanctions and about the Trump team contacts with Russian diplomats. Listen to this.
No agreements whatsoever. We never even get down to that. Our ambassador has met someone. And what is an ambassador supposed to do? That's what he gets money for. It's absurd to accuse him of that. It's diplomatic service. It's astounding.
All right, so Matthew, what do you make of that response?
Well, I think, Wolf, this was classic Putin holding up his hands and say there's nothing untoward that happened here, and ridiculing any suggestion that anything nefarious did happen. But the fact is, you know, there are lots of concerns about the sanctions here. Officially, of course, Russian officials say that they were not the instigators of these sanctions, and they're not going to be the ones to instigate the negotiations to get rid of them. But we have to remember a couple of things. First of all, these US sanctions are causing real pain to Russia's already fragile economy. They're having an impact on economic growth here. There's also the issue of the fact that you know, this is all extremely difficult for Vladimir Putin, and you know, he wants these sanctions lifted, Wolf, and that's something that, although they don't talk about it publicly, privately there are these persistent rumours that a backroom deal has been, if not done, then at least discussed with members of the Trump team and the Trump administration.
Matthew, there are also some significant discrepancies when it comes to a meeting that the senior Trump advisor, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, had with the head of a Russian bank that's under U.S. sanctions right now. Walk us through the discrepancies.
Yeah, well, the head of the bank is called Sergei Gorkov. He runs the Vneshekonom Bank, one of Russia's biggest banks. They had a meeting. He had a meeting with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of President Trump, and his special advisor, of course, back in December at Trump Tower in New York. There's been a discrepancy about what the meeting was about. The bank says that this was about the bank's future business. They met Jared Kushner, they say, in his capacity as the head of Kushner Companies, his family's sprawling property empire. The White House had a very different take, though, saying that this was a diplomatic diplomatic meeting, that Kushner was at that meeting in his capacity as a member of the Trump transition team. And so, you know, we really wanted to get to the bottom of what it is that was actually discussed at that meeting. Now, Sergei Gorkov is a very difficult man to pin down, but we actually caught up with him a couple of days ago here in St. Petersburg and tried to get some answers.
Mr. Gorkov, quick question. What did you really speak to Jared Kushner about in New York when you met him in December?
No comments.
Did you talk about sanctions? Excuse me.
No comments.
Well, what was discussed? The White House says it was a diplomatic meeting, that Kushner met you as part of the transition team. Your bank says it was a business meeting.
Thank you so much.
Well, just to indicate how much of an issue the sanctions are for the Russians, I was in a session here at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum earlier today, and Putin was addressing members of US business leaders that have come to St. Petersburg to hear him talk, and he made a direct appeal to them to help restore normal political dialogue. He wasn't talking about politics, really. He was talking about economics and sanctions in particular. That was the message that Putin had to deliver to US business leaders here in St. Petersburg a few hours ago, Wolf.
Very interesting indeed. Art and Matthew, stand by. Phil, the fired FBI director James Comey is set to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee next Thursday morning. How much do we expect to hear from Comey about his meetings with President Trump?
Well, a detailed retelling, Wolf. That's according to sources that are familiar with Jim Comey's thinking. They believe that he has the freedom to really go through exactly what happened in those meetings. And obviously, we've seen bits and pieces of the details of what those meetings entailed from Jim Comey's perspective, from memos that that he took and drafted during that process. But I think the interesting element here, and obviously the very different element here, is actually getting it in first person. Now, Wolf, it's worth noting, there are limits to what Jim Comey can and will say, not just because, particularly in the open portion of this hearing. And you just need to look at what's going on behind the scenes here. Jim Comey and his team have been talking with Bob Mueller, the special counsel, trying to make sure that nothing Jim Comey talks about, no area that he goes into during this hearing would run crosswise with the investigation that Bob Mueller is now overseeing. But the expectation is that those meetings with the president would not fall into that category. And so, because of that fact, expect, at least at this time, that on that hearing, in that public session on June 8th, Jim Comey will go through in detail what exactly happened in those one-on-one meetings between him and the president.
Next Thursday morning, we'll, of course, have live coverage. Jim Acosta, Phil Mattingly, Matthew Chance, all thanks to all of you very much. Meanwhile, the White House says President Trump will decide whether to try and block the testimony of the FBI director he fired. Here's what the White House counselor, Kellyanne Conway, said this morning when asked about James Comey's appearance before Congress next week.
Does he want former Director Comey to testify before Congress?
Well, we'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies. The last time he testified under oath, the FBI had a scurry to correct that testimony.
So the president's not going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
All right, let's bring in our chief political analyst, Gloria Borger, our justice reporter, Laura Jarrett. Laura, first of all, explain what that would mean, executive privilege to prevent, if in fact they wanted to go down that road, the White House, to prevent Comey from testifying.
Well, the way this works is that the president should be able to enjoy full and frank conversations with his advisors and with his cabinet members without worrying that another branch of government is going to be able to discover those conversations. But the issue here, remember, is that James Comey is now a private citizen. So if he wants to try to block this testimony, he would have to have his lawyers run into court and get an order saying that he can't testify. A pretty unprecedented step that doesn't happen every day, sure enough.
Yeah, I suspect it won't happen, but we shall see. Gloria, there's been some question why Comey didn't take action if he felt he was being pressured by the president to end the investigation into fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Listen to this exchange with Senator Mazie Hirono during Comey's May 3rd testimony.
So if the Attorney General or senior officials at the Department of Justice opposes a specific investigation, can they halt that FBI investigation?
In theory, yes.
Has it happened?
Not in my experience, because it would be a big deal to tell the FBI to stop doing something that without an appropriate purpose. I mean, oftentimes they give us opinions that we don't see a case there, and so you ought to stop investing resources in it. But I'm talking about a situation where we were told to stop something for a political reason. That would be a very big deal. It's not happened in my experience.
All right, so Gloria, what are you hearing from your sources? I know you're doing a lot of reporting on all of this.
Well, what I'm hearing from a source who is close to Comey is that what he felt at the time, Wolf, was that he was disturbed enough after these series of meetings with the president that he decided to memorialize his notes, and that each individual thing he may not have seen as an obstruction of justice, that if he had seen it as an obstruction, he would have done more than write a memo. But we also know he had an ongoing investigation at the time. But taken in aggregate, and after he was fired, he may well have come to a different conclusion. That's why his testimony next week is going to be so stunning and so interesting, because he originally believed that the president was being inappropriate and that he could, I was told, school him or train him about the right way to interact with the FBI director. And so he kept these notes. But if you look back on it now, Wolf, was there a pattern here, particularly after Comey got fired? We have to see whether what he felt at the time in those memos and whether he feels the same way now about what the president was trying to do.
Very interesting. Laura, let's get back to the legal issue of trying to stop Comey from testifying. Has the President Trump, actually hurt his chances, as some legal scholars believe, of possibly trying to invoke executive privilege to block the Comey testimony by talking publicly so much about his decision to fire Comey?
The short answer, Wolf, is yes. And the reasoning is this. Courts say you don't get to use privileged testimony as a sword in one context and a shield in another. So the president doesn't get to reference 3 alleged conversations where Comey assured him that he wasn't under investigation as a sword in that context, but then now blocked Comey from testifying in another. In other words, Comey gets to tell his side of the story once the president has put these communications out there.
Gloria, this is basically a case, at least so far, he said, but Comey's testimony sets the stage for a major political showdown. Give us some context.
Well, Jim Comey is a controversial figure, Wolf. Democrats don't have a lot of love for Comey, and now neither do a lot of Republicans. And so he comes to that stage with people having a lot of preconceived notions about him. The president doesn't like him. In fact, after his last testimony, we know that he fired him because he was so upset about that testimony. So I think that it's going to be up to the Congress here, the people who are asking the questions, to try and get to the bottom of this for the American people about exactly what Comey was thinking in these memos when he wrote them, and that ask him, did you believe it was obstruction of justice at the time, or do you believe it's obstruction of justice now? And why were you so disturbed in your encounters with the President of the United States that you thought it was important enough to memorialize your conversations? It is a he said, but James Comey has his notes, Wolf.
We'll see if those notes show up next week during the testimony. Gloria Borger, Laura Jarrett, thanks to both of you. CNN will, of course, have live special coverage around former FBI Director James Comey's testimony in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. That's next Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern, right here on CNN. Coming up, Steve Bannon front and center during the president's announcement on climate change. Ivanka and Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt, who strongly supported the president's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. They'll be taking questions from reporters in just a few minutes. We'll have live coverage of that coming up. Meanwhile, at least 3 governors so far are fighting the president's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, saying they'll go green with or without him. One of them is the California Governor, Jerry Brown, who said in part, and I'm quoting him now, Donald Trump has absolutely chosen the wrong course. Trump is AWOL, but California is on the field, ready for battle, close quote. Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California disagrees. He's joining us now. He supports the president's decision. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
A study, Congressman, from the Public Policy Institute of California found that 89% of the people in your state believe the effects of global warming are already happening or will happen. President Trump, as you know, has called climate change a hoax created by China. His aides refuse to say whether he still believes that. Listen to these exchanges over the past couple days.
Does the president believe climate change is a hoax?
This is not about whether climate change is occurring or not.
Does President Trump still believe climate change is a hoax?
You're going to have to ask him. You're going to actually have to ask him.
Can you say whether or not the president believes that human activity is contributing to the warming of the climate?
Honestly, I haven't asked him.
Okay.
And get back to you.
I'll ask it one more time. Does he believe global warming is a hoax?
You should ask him that.
Kellyanne Conway.
And I hope you have your chance.
I do not speak for the president.
All right, first of all, Congressman, have you spoken to the president about this? Do you know if he still believes that man-made, or at least man and women for that matter, have a role in climate change, that it's real?
Well, I've not spoken to him, but of course climate change is real. It's been going on for 4.5 billion years. Global warming is real. It's been going on and off since the last ice age. The great debate is over to what extent human activity plays a role and what should be done about it.
Well, you believe that human activity plays a role in climate change?
Well, when I look at the paleoclimatology of the planet, we know that during the Jurassic period, 150 million years ago, carbon dioxide levels were about 5 times higher than they are today. During the PETM, the Pleistocene-Eocene thermal maximum, we know that global temperatures averaged about 13 degrees higher than they are today. Now, I'm not a history major, but I believe that that was before the invention of the SUV. So as I look at the broad span of our experience on this planet, it seems to me that that's still very much an open question to what extent human activity is affecting, compared to natural processes that seem to be much stronger influence on both carbon dioxide levels as well as global temperatures.
So you're not ready to go along with most scientists who believe human activity does play a role in climate change?
You know, I go out onto the internet and I see a raging scientific debate among many noted and respected climatologists. Freeman Dyson, for example, John Christie, Fred Singer. So I have trouble accepting the notion that we're supposed to stop debating the subject when science loves a discussion, they love a debate, and when somebody tells you the debate's over, that's usually not a scientist speaking, that's a politician masquerading as a scientist.
All right, so I'll take that as you're not convinced what most scientists have concluded, that human activity does play a role. As you also know, Congressman, workers in your state, California, they've benefited greatly from renewable energy. California has the highest rate of solar jobs per capita in the country last year. Climate deal promoted clean energy growth. Would that not have benefited your state if the president had agreed to go along with the Paris Climate Accord?
If there's a genuine market demand for these products, they're going to continue to do very well. My concern is when consumers are forced to buy overpriced products, or when struggling families, through higher utility bills and higher taxes, are forced to send billions of dollars of subsidies to these politically well-connected green energy companies. I'd like to see them stand on their own 2 feet for a change, and if what they say about their products is true, they'll do very well.
One final question. Is it awkward or at all embarrassing to you that 195 countries support this Paris Climate Accord? Now 3 oppose it, the United States being one, the announcement yesterday because of the president's decision. Syria opposes it, and Nicaragua opposes it because it doesn't go far enough. Is that at all awkward that the U.S. is now with those 2 countries against 195 other countries?
Well, Mother always told me that if all your friends are jumping off a bridge, you don't need to do so as well. I'll guarantee you this. When those other countries get into trouble, the first place they're going to come running is the United States. And the stronger our economy is, the better able we'll be to help them. And that's what this decision was all about.
And if they ask for help, will you help them?
Absolutely.
You'll give them money?
Well, we'll certainly try to persuade them that the policies they've adopted are directly responsible for the economic difficulties they're suffering.
Congressman Tom McClintock of California, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, President Trump claiming to have added more than 1 million jobs since the election. We're going to fact check that figure, plus the jobs report. The unemployment numbers are likely to be a topic of discussion over at the White House briefing, scheduled to begin any moment. Agency Scott Pruitt to come out and hold a briefing with reporters just one day after the president announced he was withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, saying he wants to renegotiate it. They should be coming to the lectern any moment now. We'll have live coverage once Sean Spicer and Scott Pruitt are there. The May unemployment numbers, meanwhile, are in. There were 138,000 new jobs added to the United States last year. That's lower than expected, but as CNN Money's chief business correspondent, Christine Romans, explains, the real news is in the unemployment level.
Wolf, here's the headline for you. The lowest unemployment rate in 16 years. Got to go back to 2001 to find a jobless rate that low, 4.3%. One of the reasons here, we've had strong jobs gains for months now, but one of the reasons here is as well, some people dropped out of the labor market. That drove the jobless rate down a little bit. Let's look at job creation. It is, again, steady job creation. 80 months in a row now, a record of private sector job growth, 80 months in a row. But you're seeing the pace of the jobs gains moderate a little bit, 138,000, less than economists had been forecasting. And when you look at jobs gains, say, from February to May of this year, compare that with last year and the year before, you're seeing the pace of job growth slow a little bit. Still good, but slowing a little bit. Here are the sectors. Overall, manufacturing lost 1,000 jobs. Mining and logging gained 7,000. About 400 of those, we're told, were coal mining jobs. Part of the big political debate, of course. Healthcare, a steady performer there. 24,000 net new jobs created in healthcare. The president has promised to create 25 million jobs over 10 years. Wolf, if he's going to keep that promise, he's going to have to just about double job gains from what we got this month. Wolf?
All right, Christine, thanks very much. Let me bring in Stephen Moore. He's a CNN senior economics analyst, a former economic advisor to the Trump campaign. Stephen, thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, Wolf.
All right, so looking at those numbers, dropping unemployment rate, 4.3%, which is good, but less than expected job growth. What's your major takeaway?
Well, I was a little disappointed with that number. You know, it's not terrible, but, you know, we should be doing better. I'd like to see 200,000 plus a month. And by the way, if Donald Trump is going to fulfill his promise of 25 million jobs, he's going to have to get that number about twice as high. But I think Christine Romans made a very good point that we're very close right now to full employment in the United States with that low unemployment rate. And by the way, the other statistic called the U6, I don't want to get too technical here, but that includes people who've dropped out of the workforce. That's been dropping as well, which is a healthy sign that right now, when I talk to employers, Wolf, around the country, and I ask them, what's your biggest problem? More and more I hear them say, we can't find the workers we need, rather than you know, the fact that there's unemployment. So, you know, if you're looking for a job now, is a pretty good time to be doing it.
So who gets the credit for that upswing? Would you say the current president, President Trump, or his predecessor, former President Obama? Who deserves the credit for this dramatic turnaround over the past 8 years?
Well, I mean, look, the job growth has been steady but slow, and I do think the economy has underperformed under Obama, and I think it's one of the reasons that Trump lost. But you know, this is still, and to some extent, the Obama economy, and until Trump really gets his economic program in place, it's going to be hard for him to take, you know, huge credit for it. Although we did see a bounce up in the stock market right after he was elected. There's a lot of confidence right now, by the way, Wolf, in the economy. You see that in the consumer confidence numbers, and especially in business confidence. They're optimistic. They're spending a little bit more on you know, heavy equipment and things like that. And I have to just say, because yesterday, you know, we talked almost all day about this issue of the climate change treaty, and I had been making the point that the coal industry is on a little bit of a rebound. And it's interesting, one of the few sectors that did pretty well in that report was the mining sector. We are seeing a little bit of a comeback in coal and oil and gas now.
But there's still a ton of jobs in the solar area, in renewable energy jobs. They're going up rather dramatically, right?
You know, those numbers have been going up, but that's from a pretty low base. But the idea that, you know, a lot of liberals said, you know, there's no way that Donald Trump can bring these coal jobs back, and so far, so good. We'll see. I mean, these are just preliminary numbers, and it's only been a few months. But so far, the signs are pretty good. You know, coal demand was up 16% so far this year, which is a pretty good number, as a lot more coal is being used for steel, because around the world there's a lot more demand for buildings and construction and so on. But so I guess the takeaway here is we got to do better. You know, this is a decent number, but I want to, and by the way, as we see more job growth, Wolf, and more demand for jobs, what we're hoping to see, I think all Americans are hoping to see, is wage gains. We saw a little bit of a wage gain in this report, but you know, it's been 15 years or so since we've had some really pretty robust increases in the wages for the American workers.
One final question, Stephen. You think the president now is coming around and accepting these numbers? Because, as you know, during the campaign, he always says these numbers were phony, don't believe them. When they say the unemployment number, which is now 4.3%, he would say it's closer to 15% or 20%. They're not including this. You think he's coming around and accepting the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers?
Well, I don't think we were saying, and I was, you know, part of that team when he was saying those things. I don't think we were saying that the numbers were, you know, false. I think we were saying that they were misleading in the sense that I do think that U6 number that does include people who are in part-time jobs, who want a full-time job, and people who've dropped out. I mean, I think that's the biggest factor that we're all kind of scratching our head as economists, wondering what's going on. You know, you have job growth now, and you have demand for labor, and you know, we're still seeing so many millions of Americans on the sidelines, Wolf, and that's a bit of a paradox. And if we're going to get the economy moving again, we got to push those people who are outside of the labor force, who are employable, able-bodied. We got to get them in the labor force.
Stephen Moore, thanks as usual for joining us.
Okay, take care. Have a great day.
All right, coming up, we're waiting once again for the White House press briefing to begin, scheduled to begin any moment now. A lot of the issues certainly will be asked by reporters. Climate change, fired FBI Director James Comey's upcoming testimony next Thursday morning, executive privilege among the topics likely to be raised by Ron Spicer.
Good afternoon, everyone. EPA Administrator Pruitt is here today to deliver a brief statement on the President's announcement yesterday and answer any questions you have regarding the Paris Climate Accords decision that the President reached yesterday. As always, I ask that you keep your questions for Administrator Pruitt on topic. Once he's finished, I'll be back up here to answer some questions of the day. I would note that he has a flight to head to, so we're going to try to keep this relatively short on his end. With that, Administrator Pruitt.
Well, it's good to be with you this afternoon, and I want to first begin by saying that the President made a very courageous decision yesterday in behalf of America. He put America's interests first with respect to environmental agreements and international discussions. I really appreciate his fortitude. I really appreciate his leadership in this matter. The discussion over the last several weeks has been one of a thoughtful deliberation. He heard many voices across a wide spectrum of vantage points, and the President made a very informed and I think thoughtful and important decision for the country's benefit. You know, what we have to remember when it comes to environmental agreements and international agreements with respect to things like the Paris Agreement is we have nothing to be apologetic about as a country. We have reduced our CO2 footprint to levels of the early 1990s. In fact, from 2000 to 2014, we reduced our carbon footprint by up over 18%. And that's been largely accomplished through innovation and technology, not government mandate. So when we look at issues like this, we are leading with action and not words. I also want to say that exiting Paris does not mean disengagement. In fact, the President said yesterday that Paris represents a bad deal for this country. It doesn't mean that we're not going to continue the discussion. To export our innovation, to export our technology to the rest of the world, to demonstrate how we do it better here is, I think, a very important message to send. He indicated that he's going to either re-enter Paris or engage in a discussion around a new deal with a commitment to putting America first. The President has said routinely he's going to put the interest of American citizens at the head of this administration. That's in trade policy, that's in national security, that's in border security, that's in right-sizing Washington, D.C., and he did that with respect to his decision yesterday on Paris. So with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I don't know your name, so you'll have to forgive me of that. And if I just point to you, and we'll just go from there. Yes, ma'am. Your name?
Mary Bruce with ABC.
Hello, Mary.
Thank you for taking our questions. Just hoping you can clear this up once and for all. Yes or no, does the President believe that climate change is real and a threat to the United States?
You know what's interesting about all the discussions we had through the last several weeks have been focused on one singular issue. Is Paris good or not for this country? That's the discussions I've had with the President. So that's been my focus. The focus remained on whether Paris put us at a disadvantage, and in fact it did. It put us at an economic disadvantage. You may not know this, but Paris, it set targets of 26 to 28%. With the entire agenda of the previous administration, we still fell 40% short of those targets. It was a failed deal to begin with, and even if all of the targets were met by all nations across the globe, it only reduced the temperature by less than 2/10 degree. So that is something that the president focused upon with respect to how it impacted us economically and whether there were good environmental objectives that were achieved as a result of Paris. His decision was no, and that was the extent of our discussions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
2/10 of 1% statistic that you're citing, the MIT scientists who helped with that report say that Trump, quote, badly misunderstood the findings of that report, and that, in fact, if we take no action, temperatures could rise a devastating 5 percentage points. So specifically, what other science?
There were other studies that were published. There were other studies published at the time. The MIT study was something that, as you indicated, showed 2/10 degree. They didn't have a corner on the market as far as the studies at that time. There were many at that point. We can provide those to you. What's clear about Paris, what's clear, is if you go back and look at the criticism that was being levied against the Paris Agreement, it wasn't just from folks in this country who wanted it to be ratified or were critical of the processes. The environmental left was very critical of Paris. In fact, James Hansen is an individual who said at the time it was a fake and a fraud, and the General Counsel of the Sierra Club said the same thing. So if you go back and read the media accounts, there was much criticism, largely because it did not hold nations like China and India accountable. As you know, China did not have to take any steps of compliance until 2030. India had no obligations until $2.5 trillion of aid were provided. And Russia, when they set their targets, they set 1990 as their baseline, which allowed them to continue emitting more CO2. In this country, we had to have a 26 to 28% reduction in greenhouse gases, which represented the Clean Power Plan and the entire climate action agenda of the past administration. Yes, sir.
I'd like to go back to the first question that was asked that you didn't answer. Does the president believe today that climate change is a hoax? That's something, of course, he said in the campaign. When the pool was up in the Oval Office with him a couple days ago, he refused to answer. So I'm wondering if you can speak for him.
You know, I did answer the question because I said the discussions the president and I have had over the last several weeks have been focused on one key issue. Is Paris good or bad for this country? The president and I focused our attentions there. He determined that it was bad for this country. It hurt us economically. It didn't achieve good environmental outcomes, and he made the decision to reject the Paris deal. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Given the fact that you and other administration officials haven't been able to outline the president's views on climate change, why should other countries believe that the president wants to negotiate a new deal in good faith?
As I indicated in my comments yesterday, and the president emphasized in his speech, this administration and the country as a whole, we have taken significant steps to reduce our CO2 footprint to levels of the pre-1990s. What you won't hear, how did we achieve that? Largely because of technology, hydraulic fracturing, and horizontal drilling that has allowed a conversion to natural gas and the generation of electricity. You won't hear that from the environmental left. And so we need to export clean coal technology. We need to export the technology in natural gas to those around the globe, India and China, and help them learn from us on what we've done to achieve good outcomes. We've led with action, not words. Paris, truly, Paris at its core was a bunch of words committed to very, very minimal environmental benefits and cost this country a substantial amount of money and put us in an economic disadvantage. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Does the president believe that, or does the administration believe that any additional deal on carbon emissions, whether it's Paris or a subsequent deal, needs to...
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. Can you...
Does the administration believe that any deal, whether it's a revised Paris agreement or another carbon emissions deal, needs congressional approval, either as a treaty or some other form?
Well, I think it's clear with respect to the Paris agreement that there are concerns by the administration. The President expressed this constitutionally in his speech yesterday. I have similar concerns that it should have been submitted to the U.S. Senate for ratification. I think it depends on the nature of the deal, what you actually negotiate. If we're talking about exporting innovation and technology to the rest of the globe, I would say not. I would say that that's not something that needs to be submitted to the U.S. Senate. I would say, however, that if you're setting targets, if you're setting emission targets that are enforceable domestically through regulation or statute, then very much so. The voice of American citizens across the country needs to be heard through the ratification process. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Obviously, a lot of people from the White House are not willing to answer this question of what the president's view is on climate change. So let's talk about your personal views. In March, you said there's tremendous disagreement about the degree of human impact, and you would not agree that it's a primary contributor to global warming. Would you agree that human activity contributes at all to global warming?
I don't know if you guys caught my confirmation process or not, but it's a very intense process, by the way. But that confirmation process, I indicated that in fact global warming is occurring, that human activity contributes to it in some manner. Measuring with precision, from my perspective, the degree of human contribution is very challenging, but it still begs the question, what do we do about it? Does it pose an existential threat, as some say? You know, people have called me a climate skeptic or a climate denier. I don't know what it means to deny the climate. I would say that there are climate exaggerators. In fact, many